Professor Peter Murray from University of Birmingham. Then after Professor Peter Murray deliver his speech, we will also listen Professor Ahmar Mahbub from University of Sydney. Okay, dear college, this session will be chaired by my colleague, Maria Ulfa. Maria Ulfa, are you there?
Yes, Arif, thank you.
Okay, please, would you please to taking lead this session?
Yes, thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the second LITA International Conference collaboration with the Department of English Literature, State Islamic University, Saripidayatullah, Jakarta. Before we start, let me introduce myself. My name is Maria Ulfa. You can call me Maria or Ulfa. I am a lecturer of English Literature from Department of English Literature, State Islamic University, Saripidayatullah, Jakarta. In this plenary session, I'm going to be the chair of this session. Now we are going to have the plenary session with two speakers. The first speaker is Professor Peter Murray from the University of Birmingham, the UK, and the second speaker is Professor Ahmar Mahbub from the University of Sydney, Australia. Hello, Professor Murray and Professor Mahbub. How are you today?
Hello, very well, thank you.
Professor Mahbub, can you hear me? Can we check your sound? Still mute? We cannot hear. Sorry, we cannot hear your voice. Admin, can you help us? We still cannot hear Professor Mahbub. Okay, while we are waiting Professor Mahbub, perhaps there is technical problem in a Zoom speaker, so we will go back with Professor Mahbub after this. So let me introduce the speakers first. Okay, the first speaker is Professor Peter Murray. He is a professor of 20th century literature at the University of Birmingham, the UK. He specialized in 20th and 21st century writing and contemporary literature, in particular colonial and post-colonial literature, culture and theory, and he has a specialist interest in issues of race, nation, and diaspora in South Asian writing. Some of his books are Fiction of India, Narrative and Power, and then Rohinton Mystery, and next is Alternative Indias, Framing Muslim, Culture, Diaspora, and Modernity in Muslim Writing, and Muslim Trust and Multiculturalism, and then Islamophobia and the novel, and Contesting Islamophobia. So these are some of his specialists. And the second speaker is Professor Ahmar Mahbub. He is a Pakistani linguist. As a professor at the Department of Linguistics at the University of Sydney, Australia, he is keenly interested in the application of language sciences to developmental issues. His primary research interest is on examination of policies, practices, and implication of language variation in local and global contexts. In pursuing this goal, he draws from and contributes to a range of linguistic and applied linguistic tradition, theories, and methodologies. He was the co-editor of TESOL Quarterly alongside Brian Paltridge for several years. He was also the associate editor of Linguistic and the Human Sciences and served on the editorial boards of a number of journals. So, The time for each speaker is maximum 40 minutes. After the presentation of all speakers, we are going to have a discussion session. So for all participants, you can prepare for the question and comment after the speaker's presentation. So for the first session, Professor Mori, the time is yours.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you to Hasnul and thank you to all the organisers of this wonderful conference. Greetings to everyone from Lahore, Pakistan. I'm not so far away, not as far away as if I was in London or Birmingham, but here I should say good morning, and there I think is good afternoon now. I'm going to share my screen, if that's possible. Let's give it a go and see, which will mean that you don't have to look at me the whole time, which will be a relief for everyone concerned, I think. And if I just maximize the slideshow there, I hope. See if I can. There we go. I've just produced this to illustrate some of the points I want to make. The brief really was to talk about transnational Muslim writing generally, and you can see that my title here today is Performing Transnational Muslim Writing, taking the case, a single case study in a way, to illustrate some of my points, that being Kamla Shamsi's 2017 award-winning novel Home Fire. So first of all, what does it mean to be a transnational Muslim writer? And what does it mean to produce transnational Muslim writing? The distinction between those two questions is not as arbitrary as it may first appear, and it takes us to the heart of a particular conundrum facing writers today who are trying to articulate the experience of Muslims in our modern interconnected world. Taking the first interpretation about the transnational Muslim writer can take us into the realms of author biography. A transnational Muslim writer might be a writer of Muslim faith or cultural heritage who has moved across national borders and is now domiciled in some place other than their point of departure. This describes the position of many authors in what is now a worldwide Muslim diaspora, even when their attitude to that position, and indeed to matters of faith, may vary enormously. The second proposition focuses on the qualities or the themes of transnational Muslim writing, and it locates transnationality there less in the biography of the author and more in a certain view of the world that often finds its way into their writing. That's to say, writers may take as their subject matter the experiences of characters who have themselves crossed borders or where globalized economic, political and military forces decisively affect the fate of Muslim characters. In this kind of writing, the power of the nation is often seen to be constraining or unwelcoming, making the lives of Muslim citizens with transnational kinship networks more hazardous. In this second description, we can see the outline of many novels and short story collections produced in the years since the September 11th, 2001 terror attacks on the United States and the subsequent declaration of a war on terror. In the work of many contemporary Muslim writers, the vast securitization network brought to bear to track, trace, discipline, and even sometimes deport Muslim subjects in the West becomes the focal point. Such writing is transnational because it captures something about the effects of that resurgent nationalism that has been a feature of the geopolitical landscape in the 21st century. In particular, the impact on Muslim subjects, often migrants or the children of migrants, whose status in Western countries can now more easily be called into question. The author about whom I want to talk today, the British Pakistani novelist Kamla Shamsi, would certainly fall under the second of our categories of the transnational, while her biography, she was born in Pakistan, studied in America and now lives in Britain, makes her equally at home in the first. One of the things I want to argue, however, is that Shamsi's works have a pressing interest in showing how the recent constraining developments for Muslims were not brought spontaneously into being by 9/11, but are a continuation of historical forces and attitudes traceable to the Age of Empire. The experiences of transnational Muslim subjects in novels such as 2008's Burnt Shadows by Shamsi and the one I'm going to look at today, Home Fire, from 2017, are always understood as played out under the shadow of the nation and its ability to cast out or even kill those who trouble official discourses of belonging and feeling. But there's one more way of understanding the position of the transnational Muslim writer, and I want to allude to that before I look more closely at Home Fire, and that is as a product of a particular set of images for a marketplace whose centre of gravity is not primarily in Muslim countries, but in the metropolitan centres of the West where the biggest readership can be found. In other words, Muslim writing as a category is frequently expected to provide for curious but largely unknowledgeable readers in the West an inside line on how Muslims think and feel. This interest, which Rehana Ahmed has described as anthropological, was certainly a big factor in the upsurge of interest in Muslim writing after 9/11. Some of this curiosity was, of course, linked to that post-attack concern in the West to find an answer to the proverbial question, why do they hate us? Yet before long, this slightly narcissistic set of motivations was replaced by a more open interest in hearing firsthand, so to speak, from authors taken to represent those countries and cultures that were associated with Islam. The awkward balance between a desire for knowledge and a fear of what one might hear when the West actually starts listening to the East is captured most resonantly in Mohsin Hamid's 2007 novel, The Reluctant Fundamentalist, where the wary standoff between the Pakistani narrator and his silent American interlocutor encapsulates the international suspicions of that moment, but also enacts a deliberate subversion of the expectations of such an exchange. That's to say, rather than tell us why the protagonist of that novel has become a fundamentalist, which he hasn't, the novel plays with that and many other favoured cliches used to describe the so-called clash of civilizations. And it does so in a way that shows the text and its author to be conscious always of how this message will be received and the story placed within a marketplace for Muslim narratives where certain assumptions are in play. Thus, writers of Hamid and Shamsi's generation understand the category of the Muslim writer to be a product of Western-facing literary industries and markets. When they embrace this position, they do so ambivalently and ironically, being often concerned to debunk expectations and to make readers aware that the commonplaces which sometimes distort ideas about Muslims and what they say and write have their own historical antecedents. In short, they inscribe in their text a certain self-consciousness about their position as purveyors of transnational Muslim writing. Kamala Shamsi has noted that tendency to look towards Muslim background writers to explain something about the burning issues around Islam. In an interview, she recalls how she was in demand after 9/11 by journalists wanting to learn more about Pakistan, the land of her birth. She says, "At first I was doing quite a lot of that, and I wasn't a two-way intermediary. My role was to say to England or America, look, here is the more nuanced truth about the place I am from. After a while, I pulled back from that because I didn't want to be pigeonholed in that either, and I'm certainly not a spokesperson or representative." For Shamsi, it seems, part of the task of a transnational Muslim writer might be to find a way to subvert this anthropological framing of Muslims and of Muslim writers themselves as scribes whose duty it is to tell us in the West something about them in the East. For Shamsi, that interest is always there in the way that her books are concerned to show current events as the result of historical factors, chief among which are the legacies of empire. How to tell these stories then comes to mean reckoning with the expected stories, the ways in which narratives of South Asia have been told before, and how these tellings are always inscribed with power. Her writing is scattered with references and allusions to that mythologizing that seems to have been endemic whenever writers turned, as Kipling would say, east of Suez. So, A God in Every Stone from 2014 is constructed on layers of preceding narratives about, in that book, Peshawar, which takes us back from the novel's main interwar setting through echoes of Forster and Kipling via romances such as Layla and Majnun, or tales of epic heroes like Malalay of Mewand, to inscriptions left by ancient Persian conquerors and the fragmented remnants of pre-Islamic Buddhism. So for Shamsi, understanding South Asia means understanding the ways it has been imagined and overwritten, if you like, before. This feature of her technique is present in the fabular qualities of her debut novel, In the City by the Sea, from 1998, and it's also to be found in the 2005 novel, Broken Verses, taking shape in the delusions of the heroine, raised in a highly literate home where the consolations offered by Urdu love poetry come to be mistaken for reality. When it comes to Shamsi's most recent novel, Home Fire, we can see this reckoning with the already written emerging in the way the novel starts off seemingly very firmly grounded in detailed social realism, but ends up branching off into the realms of the epic in its final scenes. As the quest of the book's lovers culminates along with its search to find a register equal to the passions at play. I've called this quality in Shamsi's work mythic realism, a yielding of quotidian detail to intertextual quotation, the bolder colours of tableau-like scenes, and heightened symbolism. Indeed, as I'm going to argue, Home Fire takes this tendency further by placing the notion of performance centre stage, so to speak. Shamsi's writing tells us that to be a transnational Muslim writer, you must first carve a path through the stories that have gone before. Home Fire then marks both a continuation of and a departure from the preoccupations and techniques of Shamsi's previous writing. While the novel is, like her early work, concerned with family secrets and their fallout, the focus here is on the British Pakistani diaspora and its contrasting fates in the West after 9/11. There is also a wider social canvas which allows for more detailed consideration of migrants beyond the cosmopolitan elite who populate the first few novels. Here, the working class Pasha siblings from Preston Road, Wembley in North London share equal billing with the well-heeled family of the first Muslim to become British Home Secretary, Karamat Lone. Lone's story is itself another kind of migration narrative. Although he's grown up on streets where the Pashas now live, through determination, hard work, and a strategic disavowal of his Muslim background, he has moved up the social scale, carving out a successful political career with the party of government when the novel begins. Yet, far from being a celebration of hard graft and social mobility, Home Fire instead recognises those tightening constraints around Muslims in the West, which were a feature of the years after 9/11. For the Pashas, such pressures are compounded by the loss of their father, who disappeared to pursue jihad in Bosnia in the 1990s and later died on the way to the Guantanamo Bay detention facility after 9/11. As events unfold, the legacy of this action comes decisively to shape the fate of the family and the governmental response to it, led by Lone. Now, as is quite well known, Home Fire is a direct reworking of Sophocles' 5th century BC play Antigone, a canonical classic where duty to one's nation or state collides with love of and loyalty to one's family. The play provides a framework within which characters and plot move. Sophocles' siblings Antigone, Polynices and Ismene become Anika, Parvez and Isma Pasha. Polynices' betrayal and attack on Thebes is echoed in Parvez's defection to the Islamic State terrorist group operating out of Syria. Creon, king of Thebes, becomes Karamat Lone, the Home Secretary, who likewise forbids the repatriation of Parvis's body after his death so as not to sully the soil he has betrayed. Creon's son Haemon, who is in love with Antigone, reappears in the form of the Home Secretary's son Aemon, who has changed his name to the Irish spelling E-A-M-O-N-N in order, like his father, to bury his Muslim past. And finally, Anika, who Antigone-like, enacts a ritual of mourning for the brother refused a burial in his homeland. Now, inasmuch as Shamsi's story maps closely onto its ancient Greek inspiration, we might expect a certain schematism driving the plot to its inevitable conclusion. Yet the taut energy of Shamsi's telling, coupled with the appropriateness of the theme in an era when Muslim loyalties have come increasingly into question, adds relevance and dynamism. Moreover, the startling denouement takes what had until then been a solid, densely realised world and transfigures it in the most striking example yet of that mythic realism which has become a feature of Shamsi's work as it grapples with the complexities of empire, and I'll describe how that happens in a moment. Indeed, this award-winning novel itself has arguably been transformed too, becoming, thanks to contemporary political events in Britain, a kind of roman à clef, and an instantaneous classic, encapsulating the outline of crucial debates about citizenship and rights. So it might be useful just very briefly to contextualise now one particularly salient real-life controversy. In April 2017, the then Prime Minister Theresa May appointed Sajid Javid as Home Secretary. Javid was a former banker and the first Asian to hold one of the highest offices in the government. He was also the first Muslim to do so. During his 15 months in the role, Javid caused controversy by a series of uncompromising statements on a range of issues concerning minority ethnic communities and asylum seekers. Javid is perhaps as paradoxical a figure as Karamat Lone in the novel. He has put some distance between himself and his Muslim roots, despite having himself been the victim of racism in the past. Interviewed in 2018, Javid said, my own family's heritage is Muslim. Myself and my 4 children were brought up to believe in God, but I do not practice any religion. My wife is a practicing Christian, and the only religion practiced in my house is Christianity. And interestingly, in Home Fire, there's the scene where Karamat Lone, having been photographed entering a mosque for a relative's funeral prayers, makes sure that the next photo opportunity involves him and his wife walking hand in hand into a church in order to assuage the fears of white non-Muslim voters. One of the most high-profile cases Javid had to deal with as Home Secretary was that of Shamima Begum, a young British woman of Bangladeshi heritage who as a teenager in 2015 had left her home in London with 2 friends to travel to Syria to join Islamic State fighters there. The girls were later married, becoming what were known in the press as jihadi brides. In 2018, with her husband having been killed, a pregnant Begum expressed a wish to return to Britain. In response, Javid stated that British citizens who joined Islamic State would not be allowed to return to the United Kingdom, and in February 2019 he revoked Shamima Begum's citizenship. The government claimed that she was a dual national, having citizenship of Bangladesh too, although this was disputed by the Bangladeshi authorities. The decision to revoke Begum's citizenship was controversial, with opposition politicians, church leaders and Amnesty International critical of the move, but it proved popular with the tabloid press and the public. The Begum case provided Javid, much like his fictional counterpart Lone, with the opportunity to, as the novel says, look strong on security. More than that, it raised important questions about citizenship. It's currently illegal under international law to make someone entirely stateless, but the decision to target those with dual nationality effectively creates a 2-tier system. The citizenship rights of those with 2 British parents are guaranteed. Dual nationals and the children of dual nationals are made more vulnerable. This is a topic discussed in Home Fire, where Lone proposes a bill to make it possible, this is a quote now, to make it possible to strip any British passport holder of their citizenship in cases where they have acted against the vital interests of the UK. As he insists more than once, citizenship is a privilege, not a birthright. And this is one of those moments where the book and real life merge, because that same phrase, citizenship is a privilege, not a birthright, has been used more than once by the current Conservative government. Such moments make visible the perceived tension between Britishness and Muslimness that lies at the heart of this novel. Lone comes to embody the strain, combining political ambition and the desire to conciliate his party colleagues, voters, and the right-wing press. As a grandson of the colonised who hopes one day to take his place as Prime Minister, Lone must forever be seen to be, as the text says, striding away from Muslimness. It is Lone's job as Home Secretary to secure the boundaries of acceptable Britishness, cautioning young Muslims against separating themselves from the British mainstream. He warns an audience of predominantly Muslim schoolchildren in Bradford, don't set yourselves apart in the way you dress, the way you think, the outdated codes of behaviour you cling to, the ideologies to which you attach your loyalties, because if you do, you will be treated differently, not because of racism, but because you insist on your difference from everyone else in this multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multitudinous United Kingdom of ours. In the terms coined by Lisa Lau and Anna Cristina Mendes, Karamat Lone reorientalizes himself, cementing the perceived binary between good and bad Muslims by endorsing and inhabiting the existing loyal Muslim stereotype. Yet his divided nature is always bubbling to the surface. The tensions between Lone the father of Aemon and Lone with his great office of state are never reconciled, and he only learns the lesson about the value of family that Anika sought to teach him when it is too late to save his son. So, Britishness versus Muslimness is seen always in this novel as a false dichotomy. In common with earlier novels, Home Fire pits those who attempt to reach out across borders and boundaries against those who police them. In that sense, as its title might suggest, Home Fire continues Shamsi's exploration of home spaces from which people are forcibly wrenched or which expel and reject them. Home is here exclusionary, complicated for second and third generation Muslim families by post 9/11 securitization and what Paul Gilroy has called the imperial melancholia of contemporary Britain. Shamsi is concerned to unpick such facile binaries, instead populating the novel almost entirely with a variety of British Muslim principal characters whose backgrounds are painstakingly disclosed. Here, as in her earlier work, Shamsi is determined to show current events as the result of traceable historical factors, chief among which is imperialism. In Home Fire, we can see this in the way the novel starts off seemingly firmly grounded in detailed social realism and then moves elsewhere. The desire to fix events and characters in the real world of the here and now, which is, nonetheless, a product of history, perhaps explains those extended accounts of some fairly minor characters' backgrounds in the first half of the book. Shamsi makes the point that almost everyone in the text, from Pervez Pasha and his sisters to Karamat Lone, and from the Pasha's Auntie Nasim, who's a fairly minor character, to Ayman's neighbours the Rahimis, who are even more minor characters, all of them are, to borrow the old anti-racist slogan, here because Britain was there. As the plot unfolds, each of the protagonists have their personalities and life trajectories decisively shaped by a recalibration of Britishness that positions them precariously in relation to national identity. Ironically, this is clearest in the case of Karamat Lone, who, despite doing everything he can to put a distance between himself and his Muslim background, discovers that, for all his efforts to blend into the British establishment, he is only really tolerated until his mistakes can be turned against him by political rivals. Yet it's the Pasha family who experience most calamitously the clash between humanity and national citizenship rights. Presaging the later events, the novel opens with a scene in which Isma Pasha, the sister, is interrogated by airport security officers while trying to board a flight to begin postgraduate study in the United States. It is made clear that this is an eventuality for which she is well prepared. Isma has rehearsed with her sister Anika the kinds of questions she is likely to encounter and passed answers with just the right level of compliance to satisfy her interrogators, suppressing the urge to sarcasm or irony. She displays those skills necessary for what Rustam Barucha in his book Terror and Performance calls covering, a crucial element in the ethnic passing he sees as a feature of the post-9/11 life for minorities, affirming one's cultural identity without creating trouble. He says the important thing is not to disturb the script that has been worked out in advance. And that's what you see in this scene. Isma is answering the questions and not deliberately trying not to disturb the script. Barucha's reading of the relationship between terror and performance emphasizes performance as inextricably linked to, he says, social interactions, behaviors, strategies, deceptions, manipulations, and there are a lot of all of those things in this novel, and we will see how that actually becomes the dominant motif by the end. In fact, although Isma is ultimately a more conventional figure than her sister, reporting Parvez's defection to Islamic State, counselling cooperation with the authorities and so on, she does have quite a spirited response in a later face-to-face encounter with Karamat Lone, where she pleads on her sister's behalf, and she does therefore work against the stereotype of the passive Muslim woman. Anika, her sister, is an altogether more passionate and complex character. Isma's chance encounter with the son of the Home Secretary plants the seed of an idea in Anika by the nurturing of which she believes she may just be able to secure her brother's desired return from Syria. When they meet, she begins what is at first a simulated seduction, designed to win Ayman's trust and thereafter his cooperation and influence, but which soon gives way to actual love. The novel's preoccupation with secrets and simulation begins here as Anika stages a carefully choreographed courtship in which she is not above using her hijab, conventionally seen in the West as a symbol of Muslim women's submissiveness, as a tool of seduction. It's one of those manipulations that Barucha mentions as in relation to terror and performance. Shamsi here seems to say that pervasive Orientalist stereotypes of the Muslim woman are just that, reductive, fixed traces that bear little reality to rational, calculating, flesh and blood beings in the world. Ayman is baffled but fascinated by Anika's ability to switch in and out of what he calls the frequency of their relationship. When he discovers her true motive for starting the affair, his anger is tempered by a continued inability to read this fascinating woman. Her professions of devotion prompt Ayman to muse, it was what she'd say if she were still only trying to manipulate him. It was what she'd say if she'd really fallen in love with him, and he can't decide between the two. Along with secrets, the gap between appearance and reality and what characters can will themselves to believe is also explored. The violence which Parvez has experienced at the hands of those training him for life with Islamic State, he is subjected to waterboarding and forced to endure hours in a stress position, that violence grows exponentially when the scene shifts to Syria. Here, Parvez, employed to make sound recordings for the terrorists, finds himself in a brutal, hyper-masculine environment. He is forced to record beheadings and is forbidden by a callous interpretation of Islamic modesty requirements from assisting an unveiled woman caught in the wreckage of a truck after it has been hit by a drone. The gap between the utopian dreamland of propaganda and the vicious misogynistic reality of Islamic State is one of the reasons why Parvez is trying to escape and get back home when he is gunned down at the gates of the British consulate. States, then, of all kinds in this book are dangerous fictions. Shamsi has said in an interview that the idea of the nation-state as the defining framework of a novel has less and less relevance in this interconnected world. at the very least, I seem to have become incapable of imagining a novel that is restricted within the boundaries of a single nation. In this turning outwards of her most recent novels, Shamsi demonstrates that the backwash of history as it affects individuals is not contained by borders and boundaries. This realization is central to her transnational writing. In my book, Islamophobia in the Novel, I've suggested that Shamsi in these works is undertaking what you might call a worlding of intercultural literature along the lines suggested by Jalal Qadir, who advocates treating the world in world literature as a verb, to world, in order to emphasize connections of responsibility and consequence. I would suggest this gives us a way of interpreting Shamsi's decision to use Antigone as her template. The well-known story helps to establish a transnational or worlded rather than a national literary lineage. Sophocles' play stages a human experience connected to a core set of dilemmas that repeat over time and in different contexts. Loyalty to family versus loyalty to the state, the nature of justice and law, and so on. It's for this reason that Antigone has been such a popular target for rewritings over the years, providing particularly rich rewards for writers struggling against colonial and post-colonial abuses of power. So this transnational artistic inheritance can be set against the fundamentalist nihilism of the Islamic State's caliphate and the exclusionary ethnic nationalism that lone polices. In this way, we could say that Shamsi worlds the novel against those purist forces that are trying to narrow and capture or reject and cast out human subjects. Shamsi seems, in the later part of the novel at least, to conclude that straightforward realism is insufficient to this task of worlding, and this perhaps accounts for the striking formal rerouting of Home Fire in its later sections, taking us far from the predominant social and psychological realism of the early parts into the realms of what I've called mythic realism. Home Fire is divided into 5 sections, each focalised by a different protagonist, with help from an orchestrating omniscient narrator. Isma, Ayman, Anika, Parvez and Karamat Lone all get a chance to steer some part of the story, their perspectives providing a collage of attitude and experience. It is, however, noteworthy that while most of these voices relate events in a broadly linear way, the sections led by Parvez and Anika are significantly fragmented. Parvez's recruitment by Islamic State and subsequent longing to escape is a case in point. His desire to return home is narrated to us before we learn of his disenchantment. The section narrated by Parvez thereafter moves backwards and forwards in time, filling in a sequence of actions and reactions and trying to capture for us the more elusive strands of motivation that have led him to his fateful decision to join the group. Anika's segment is even more radically disrupted, consisting of numbered parts made up of reportage, tweets, tabloid smear stories, diary entries, and fragmentary meditations on loss, together stimulating the cacophony surrounding the very public death of Parvez, which compounds Anika's grief and sends her spinning towards a breakdown. The novel culminates in an unscripted performance by Anika grieving for her dead brother in a Karachi park, while television images of her mourning are beamed around the world. When she's prevented by Lone from bringing Parvez's body home to Britain for burial, she instead travels to Pakistan to stage a vigil with his decaying corpse in front of the assembled international media. I suggest that this scene is constructed on those principles central to performance which Barucha names embodiment, affect, corporeality, kinesthetics, and reflexivity. I won't have time to go into all of those today, but I'll try and highlight one or two. This reveals how images can capture the attention and imagination more readily than words, and how the body is central to this process. It's also a performance that throws back to us the question of the consequences of terror, both that produced by the terrorist and the lasting terror resulting from life and death decisions taken by state actors. It's significant that we see this climactic protest through the eyes of Karamat Lone, watching events unfold on a television screen in his Marsham Street office in Westminster. This enforced distance further hampers his ability to understand what he is witnessing and adds mystery to the tableau-like vigil, creating the conditions whereby Anika's actions as she receives the body and begins to grieve attain mystical power. So, arrayed in the white of mourning, she arranges what the novel describes as an iconography of suffering, complete with a white sheet strewn with rose petals. As Anika bends to see once more the face of her beloved Parvez, the distance created by Lone's attempts to comprehend the spectacle and the framing effect of the media images being beamed around the world introduces an ambiguity about how to understand what happens next. Amidst the stifling heat of an impending dust storm, Anika breaks open the flimsy coffin and begins to explore her brother's remains in what almost seems a kinesthetic mime, but one where our interpretation remains distanced and provisional. So I'll just read you this small section. The girl sat back on her heels, as if only now, at this moment, had she stopped to consider what she was asking her own eyes to look at. Or maybe she was waiting for what happened next. The yellow-brown wind picked up the plywood and flung it into the air with a whipping sound. The girl lowered herself to her knees, placed her hands on the ground on either side of her, and leant forward as a child might examine some unknown animal found in the garden. Her brother, embalmed, looked not right. How else to say it? Dead. She lifted a hand, looked at it as if she wasn't sure what it was about to do next, and watched as her palm came to rest on the forehead of what had once been her twin. The hand jerked away, settled back down, slid along his skin towards his temple. The hand lifted up again, moved down to the corpse's wrist. Her mouth opened and a small word or sound may have come out, nothing the mics could pick up. Immediately after this, the wind whips up and gathers into a howl that merges with the howl of grief escaping from Anika's mouth to create what the novel calls a howl deeper than a girl, a howl that came out of the earth and through her and into the office of the Home Secretary, who took a step back. So, in the diverse and indeterminate readings this scene invites, we see a reliving of the original scene of terror as Parvez's decomposing body is slowly exposed. Through the power of global media, Anika attempts to force Lone to confront the effects of his decision. Barucha notes that terror can also be performed as one relives the act, through an immersion in its representation in the media or through a critical response to the media and the discourses that have accumulated around the event. And then I've highlighted this bit. The performance of terror is built through the accretion of these responses, not through the act of terror itself. Yet there's also the inability of Karamat Lone, the state's custodian, to move beyond ambiguities of reading to any true understanding as he watches this literally histrionic, elemental performance by Anika. Is it media manipulation or some form of magic? We're left with the feeling that the inveterate politician Karamat Lone is most impressed with Anika's ability to stage a spectacle for the assembled press. Given that the novel's frame structure is provided by Sophocles' Antigone, this denouement in the park becomes a performance within another performance, contesting the state's power to control images and classify the terrorist. It moves us beyond the increasingly shrill and disjointed surfeit of words that has preceded it to, as J.M. Coetzee would put it in another context, to a place where bodies are their own signs. Unable to move Lone by words, Anika stages a play within the play, hoping against the odds to, like Hamlet, catch the conscience of the king. In the scene of martyrdom in the park, we seem to be in the presence of something operatic, almost apocalyptic. The heightened register of the epic has seeped into what started out as a realist novel. This apotheosis of Shamsi's mythic realism is of a piece with the obtrusive symbolism, which also increases towards the end, complete with Parvez as a quasi-fairy tale dead prince encased in ice, as efforts are made to prevent his corpse from decaying, and incorporating sharpened auditory experiences. images of hot and cold, and the mixing of incongruous things. Jam in the tea Lone makes himself, melting ice mixing with the dregs of wine in a glass, a foreign body in the ice, as the text says. The novel reaches its climax with the tragic reunion of the lovers, Ayman and Anika. Ayman has followed her to Pakistan only to find himself at the last minute approached by unknown assailants who strap a bomb belt to him. In front of the horrified gaze of his father and a worldwide television audience, the lovers entwine in a final embrace with detonation seemingly imminent. Ironically, the son of the British Home Secretary is forced into the role of the suicide bomber, transcending once and for all those categorical definitions of good and bad Muslims on which the war on terror discourse depends, his body becoming the vehicle for one final performative act. I argue that we should understand these melodramatic turns to be another instance of that mythic realism with which Shamsi replaces the mundane registers of realism, the better to symbolise the suffering of those, like Parvez and Anika, deemed expendable by Western nations that are unwilling to confront or be reminded of the extent to which the conditions for radicalisation and alienation may have been set by their own double standards. Paul Veyret, quoting Amir Mufti, sees Shamsi's recent novels as engaging with the challenge of what he calls the precarious balancing act between writing about the fundamental issues facing Pakistan, and we might add Britain here, without playing to the metropolitan fascination with the spectre of Islam and stereotyped Muslim sensibilities. In her turn towards mythic realism and performance, Shamsi is attempting to inscribe a recognition that realism can offer a backstory and surface details, but that something else is needed to convey the experience of expulsion from a society whose claimed liberal values are also often said to be enshrined in the realist novel form itself. I refer you here to Edward Said's Culture and Imperialism. She answers this challenge via recourse to parodic reworkings, hypersymbolism, and moments of surrealism and melodrama. So, to conclude, Kamila Shamsi's novels have developed in ambition and sophistication to the point where she's now one of the foremost chroniclers of the modern world. She's got a new book coming out in September, incidentally. She is a chronicler who refuses, though, to shy away from the long-term effects of history, ignoring or eschewing those tempting byways where the novelist can just focus on individual psychology to the exclusion of larger structures. Rather, her work insistently calls upon us to connect past and present, just as it does the figures who populate its pages. Moreover, she's one of an increasing number of writers, among them Michael Ondaatje, Kazuo Ishiguro, Mohsin Hamid and Aminata Forna, whose work cannot be easily accommodated within the canonical boundaries of national literature, and may therefore be classed as transnational. Her novels derive much of their potency and appeal from this principled engagement with the world and the people in it, understanding them to be inextricably connected in the obstacles they face in achieving peace and justice. Geography and history, time, space, and loss. These are the raw materials with which Shamsi crafts her transnational fictions. She is a writer who understands that the challenge of doing justice to global experience is formal as well as thematic. Historical and novelistic narratives frequently share a way of presenting the world which takes a singular view for granted, whereas Shamsi's characters are always entangled, sometimes painfully, in the collective experiences of class, race, gender and religion, just as they are impacted on by past wrongs and present injustices. For Shamsi, the webs of history are still being spun. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Maury, for your great presentation. So we learned a lot about transnational Muslim writing from your presentation. Thank you. So for participants, if you have comments or questions, you can write down on the chat box. We will discuss it after the second presentation from the second speaker, but you can just directly write the comment or the questions. Okay. Thank you, Professor Molly. Now we go to the second speaker, Professor Mahbub. Can you hear me? I want to check your voice.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes. Okay,
Okay,
right.
finally. Good. I was playing around with the technology and was hoping that everything will work. Good.
Yes. Okay. Now the time is yours, Professor Mahbub.
Thank you so much, Assalamu alaikum, for inviting me to this very interesting conference. Peter, I enjoyed your talk. My background is actually in English literature. I did an honors in literature a long time ago from Karachi University. And listening to Peter's talk today sort of took me back to my student days when we used to talk about, read literature and discuss all the stuff and look at the theoretical work and all that stuff. But since then, my life sort of moved on. In a sense, I gave up the study of literature on purpose after my honors, and I moved into linguistics. In fact, when I did this, Peter, and some of you might resonate with this. When I actually left the study of literature after my honors and shifted to the linguistics program, an applied linguistics program, my dear professors who are really good friends of mine stopped talking to me. They just stopped talking to me. And because they couldn't see why somebody would stop a study of literature and move into a boring discipline called linguistics. Right? And it's kind of interesting why I left, Peter. The reason wasn't that I'm not interested in literature. Literature is fascinating. And in fact, my talk today is actually going to be a reading of my own poetry and a discussion of that poetry in relation to language and other issues. So literature is something very much at the core of my heart. Why did I leave it? I left it because I didn't see a point being a critic of literature, drawing on other people's readings and interpretations of things that were outside my zone of observation. So imagine growing up in the Middle East and having to learn daffodils in grade 5. And it wasn't until I went to the US for my education that I first saw daffodils. But before then, I had memorized daffodil. I can still read lines of it from my childhood, right? So it's still part of me. And yet there was no reality to any of this literature at that point in time. And so in relation to, so I said, you know what, I'm going to move into doing something where I can actually do something, and literature will still be my love. So I've maintained it, but not in the same way as you have. And that actually, in a sense, has moved me in a sense of different directions, which is actually what I'll be doing a bit of today, is actually sort of a period of time, having sort of gone through from literature to linguistics, I started realizing that we have very similar problems in linguistics as we do in literature. So for example, in the teaching of English literature, we look at the English critics and the British critics and the American critics who are talking about other writers who are writing from the UK or the US or wherever it might be. And similarly, in linguistics, we are looking at European and Western linguists and looking at the theorization of language and the descriptions of language that are essentially embedded in English and European discourses. And so over a period of time, for reasons very similar to having rejected literature or a study of literature, I also abandoned a study of linguistics. So even though I'm in a program of linguistics, I actually don't necessarily do the kind of linguistics that people talk about. In fact, I am very much against it. And I hope that today's poetry and the sharing of this poetry will outline some of the reasons why this is the case, and perhaps help us to think of other alternative ways of doing it. Now, why do I choose poetry? Because poetry is short, it can capture a lot, and it can actually move people towards action. Whereas in terms of writing short stories or novels, I don't find that I have the same ability to get people engaged into action, right? It's more reflective. Whereas poetry can actually be much more action-oriented and lead directly into it. Now, so to that, I'm going to start with a poem which I actually sent as an abstract for my conference presentation. I don't actually have a name for it, so I tentatively call it Language. And here it is. So I'll read it and then go through it. Now, before I even read the poem, can you guys read the text, the image on the right-hand side?
Yes, I think so.
What does the top line say? Dilarang.
Dilarang masuk, sir.
What does it mean?
No entry.
Okay, now notice, you guys understood this even though it is not in Bahasa Indonesia. This picture is taken in Malaysia, right? And
it is Indonesian. Dilarang masuk Indonesian language.
exactly, and I want you to focus on that. I took this picture in Malaysia. So when I took this picture, the picture is of Malaysian, Bahasa Malay. But as you say, correct, Bahasa Indonesia has a lot of sharing with Bahasa Malay. And yet we call them two different languages. So why? If a language has some element of mutual intelligibility, and if mutual intelligibility is an indicator of what a language is, then why do we separate out Bahasa Malay and Bahasa Indonesia? In the context of where Peter is in Pakistan, I'll ask a similar question there. On what grounds can we separate out Hindi and Urdu when both are mutually intelligible? Right? So we notice that in the world we live today, we have these names and we have these categories and these ways of doing things, which are strange and odd and theoretically not even possible. So if language is mutually intelligible, then Bahasa Indonesia and Malaysia are actually not two languages. If language is mutually intelligible, then Hindi and Urdu are not really two languages. And yet we consider these two languages, and we consider these to be two different state languages. So we bring in the issue of nation state, which also Peter was talking about in terms of the world we live in. Because essentially all these nation states that we live in or relate to are a colonial invention, right? There was no Indonesia 100 years ago. There was no Pakistan 100 years ago. There wasn't even a Saudi Arabia 100 years ago, right? And yet we live in a world where all these nation states and things become real to us. And they become part of what we relate to, and we see it. So how do our worldviews get formed? Where does it all come from? And how is it that we can be confused so easily in matters that are so important and can lead to life or death? So I'll start with this point, language. Like computer languages program machines, human language programs people. And while we do have other senses, language can shape how we use those too. Language co-evolved with where she grew, with lands, creatures, and seasons she knew. Our elders learned all that was needed and taught it to us through boli and practice. The flow of sounds, the melodies of song, the rhythm of knowledge, the grammars of dance, the meaning of colors, the semantics of smell, the discourse of flavors, the sense of touch. A harmonic system in a mystical garden. All that changed where the tongue was cut. Our laws replaced by foreign words. Our knowledge drowned in information floods. Our wisdom is stolen through tests and books. Our traditions slaughtered by fads and trends. Our integrity replaced with greed and wants. Our humanity turned into an infectious wound. An agitated system in a turbulent existence. Now, notice in this point, what I'm trying to convey really is the centrality of what language is. And trying really hard to make us all understand what language is, right? So language co-evolved where she grew with lands, creatures, and seasons she knew. Now, if we take these two lines and look at how we categorize languages around the world, we think certain languages are more advanced, for say English. And we think of other languages, for example, an indigenous language, as being not. Now, interestingly, the difference is not in language. The difference is in the history of political oppression and expansion that comes with the English language. So with English, the English co-evolved with lands from far away. And in those lands, there were different creatures and different seasons. So as English evolved, it developed based on all these other experiences and relationships that she had. Whereas an indigenous language is spoken on a little island somewhere, does not have the same geographical range. So the people who develop it have a very good sense of the local. That's why, for example, the indigenous languages have a very delicate understanding of the soil, of the climate, of the type of fruits, the kind of roots, the leaves. They've got all the traditional medicines, everything. They know everything they need to know in the land where they live, because the language co-evolved. Now, notice then, our elders learned all that was needed and taught it to us through Boli and practice. Now, notice Boli and practice. Now, what is Boli? Boli is actually a word in my own Boli. So, Peter is in Pakistan right now. I was born in Pakistan. My parents were born in British India, and they migrated from British India with my grandparents in the 1940s and 50s. Right? So, Boli is the word in Hindi and Urdu, in Punjabi as well, and quite other South Asian languages for oral language. So Boli is only and only oral language. It does not confuse writing. Now, when we look at English literature like Peter was doing and I've done in the past, we are actually looking at the writing. Now, writing is not to be confused with language. Unfortunately, we do this all the time. We confuse oral language and written language as two modes of language. That is incorrect. That's just incorrect. It's not right. Why? Because oral language operates through a set of sensory systems that are independent of what writing uses. Right? Oral language uses our facility of hearing and ability to make sounds. Writing uses our eyesight. Right? These are two different sets of sensory systems. Our sight and our sound are independent of each other. That is why people can, everybody in the world who is able-bodied has oral language. They have Boli. It doesn't matter which part of the world you go to, whether it's an indigenous language or a non-indigenous language. Everyone has Boli, because Boli is a primary human ability, which everybody develops if they don't have any sort of problems, right? Notice it's not the same with writing. We are all taught to read and write, and we don't like doing it, right? Many languages never developed a writing system. They just didn't need to. Writing was a need of the trading classes initially, and that's where literacy evolved. It was never used for mass education. It was not used for government policy making. Instead, it was Boli. Why? Because Boli is present. It's observable. A recording is not. Whether it's an audiovisual recording or it's a recording based on written language, which is text, writing system. Neither of them are observable. That's why media can manipulate us. That's why what we read is not always true, because they're non-observable. Whereas Boli and practice are in the present. They're only in the present. They cannot be confused. Now, I'll do a little aside and then I'll come back. Now, I'm just going to pause here for a second and then come back. Now, I'll give you a couple of side sort of examples that will help you understand what I'm saying. In today's world, We all live in a world where we think of past and present and future. We think of this time as a timeline which goes from past to present to future. And we learn about this from our childhood in our language classes. We even teach it in our language classes, whether it's English, whether it's Bahasa Indonesia, whether it's Urdu or Hindi or Arabic or Spanish or any language. We teach people there's a past tense, there's a present tense, there's a future tense. We learn this in the books and we teach it to everybody. Now, if we were to just take a pause, just like I paused my sharing of the video, and we were to take a pause and say, wait a second, let's for a second not accept everything that comes to us in this written format. Let's observe what's happening in our language from the perspective of our language. That's right. Now, let's first do it in English. When we look at English, we find very quickly that you can say walk and you can say walked. But you have to say, I will walk, I may walk, I shall walk. You can see, I eat, I ate. You have to say, I can eat, I will eat, I shall eat. Now, if we realize what's happening, we will see that while in English, there is a present and a past tense that is marked by the morpheme. It's a morphophonological shift, a little marker of sound. That morpheme tells us the tense changes. The same is not true for the future. There is no future tense in the English language. It doesn't exist. Future is a modality. That's why we use modals. It can do, will, shall do. It's not like past. So in the English language itself, there is actually no future tense. And yet we are all taught this and we teach it. Because we get fooled through literacy. And we get fooled through things that we don't base on observation or practice, but have to believe in because we have to take tests and exams. And if we don't prepare our students and we haven't learned the tenses ourselves, we're never going to pass these tests. And if we don't pass these tests, you and I will not be here. Right? We have to pass all these tests that we learn based on books, which become our belief system. All of it is without observation of practice. Now, if I were to look at my own Boli, that's why I say Boli, and if I were to theorize based on my position as an indigenous person, drawing on my own Boli, then guess what? In my Boli, there is no past tense, and there is no future tense. There's only one tense, the present. That's it. If I have to talk about the past, I have to do a lot of changes throughout the sentence. If I have to talk about the future, I have to make a lot of changes throughout the sentence. It's not a tense. Not even like in English, there's past and present. In my language, there is none. So when I look at my own Boli and I start theorizing from my perspective of my Boli, I realize that the way that tense systems are constructed and taught to us, the way that we study tense systems in different languages is fundamentally flawed and wrong. Then the question, of course, comes, why do something that has no observational reality? This is where colonization comes in, right? So when Peter talks about the experiences of the colonials in the West, myself included, and we look at all these trans movements, we can see what's happening. But where does it come into play? How do these things get formed in the first place? They get formed through education and through manipulating our understanding of language. So when somebody says there are 250 languages in this country, I say, wait a second, how can you say that? As soon as you say there are 5 languages, as soon as you pluralize the term language to languages, what you have done is you have said that language is a noun, it's an entity. It's an entity because we read and learn the language in grammar books and in textbooks. We see it as an entity. Language is not an entity. It cannot be pluralized. Language is a practice. And language as practice can only occur in present. It cannot occur in past and it cannot occur in future. So right now, you're listening to me. Unfortunately, you are actually listening to a recording. So you actually have a recording of it. If there was a live audience, then the live audience can see me language, because language is a performance. I'm performing it. If you watch a recording of it, it's not a performance, it's a recording of the performance. And if you read an essay that I write, then you're actually reading an essay. It has nothing to do with language. So language is only and only a practice that can be performed in present. It is not a noun, it is not an entity. And yet, look at linguistics. We have created a discipline that does just that. And that's why I said to you, I've sort of abandoned linguistics, because it does exactly the same what literature did for me. It's based on premises that do not reflect my local understandings of things. It does not take into account the actual practice, but rather it creates beliefs. It creates beliefs, right? So when we take away the boli and we take away the practice, which are both observational, and we make our education things, our wisdom is stolen through tests and books, right? If we shift the source of information and learning, then we have essentially created a potential trap for ourselves and for our future generations. So that is part of the reason why I actually work now on decolonization of knowledge making. I don't call myself a linguist. I don't even know what to call myself, because my focus is on decolonization of how knowledge is made itself. Because we need to understand what goes on in the production of knowledge. And if we are to decolonize ourselves, which we have not, because a people cannot be independent if their education and academia is not independent. Unfortunately, whether you're in Indonesia or Pakistan, our knowledge is not independent. We have to draw on Western knowledge and traditions. And if our knowledge and approach to knowledge making is dependent on colonial sources, then we are doomed. We cannot decolonize. We'll continue the path that we have. Why? For a very interesting reason. Because social systems operate on fractals. Now, fractals, what is fractal? Fractal is repeating the same pattern at different scales. It's the same pattern you find different places. So if you look at the world that we live in, and you look at the political oppression that Peter was talking about in relation to the fiction, you will actually see the fractals of oppression throughout Kamala Shamsi's work. So it isn't in just one place, it's happening everywhere. It's the repetition of the same pattern. It's a fractal. That fractal is how social systems work. And when we look at education and academia, we realize the fractals of divide and rule are the primary fractals that operate within how we create knowledge. We divide and rule in creating knowledge. We create distinction between languages. We create distinction between linguistics and psychology, linguistics and anthropology. Now, it makes no sense to me, because in linguistics, we do linguistic anthropology, and anthropology, we do anthropological linguistics, right? In linguistics, we do psycholinguistics. In psychology, they do language in the mind, right? You see all this all over the place. We do sociolinguistics. In sociology, they do language and society, or right? They do the others. So we see there's always these things. Everything is confused. And yet what we do is we constantly dividing and dividing and dividing, and basing everything based on writing, which is not observable. So what happens because of it is that our societies become divided as well, because our ways of creating knowledge are fundamentally divisive. And so when we take that learning into our real life, our regular life, that learning and those fractals of division influence everything that we do. That's how divide and rule enabled colonization. And that's how divide and rule continues to colonize us. It is a divide and rule is not just a political strategy. Divide and rule is a strategy embedded in the colonial ways of making knowledge. And it is, if we want to become decolonized, we have to learn to shift those systems. We have to learn to base things on practice, observable, things that are real, can be seen, can be touched, can be understood, not based on belief systems. That what we have done over the last number of years. So I'll move you to a new point, another point, just linking this to another thing. Let me ask you a question before I do. Now, if we were to look at, say, sciences, now, if we were to look at material science, what is the smallest unit that builds matter? So if you were to study physics, what's the smallest physical unit that we think of as a smallest physical unit that comes together to make matter, whether that matter is a phone or a cup or anything? Sorry? An atom, right? An atom. An atom is seen as the smallest thing that combines together to make matter. Now, of course, if you're a physicist, you can argue that there are things that are atomics, blah, blah, blah. But for a general sense, atoms good enough. We know atoms combine to make matter. Now, that's true for all sciences. Whether you're studying physics or chemistry or medicine, it makes no difference, because atom is the single unifying thing that puts everything together. Right? It's across all sciences. Now, if I were to ask you a counter question and say, all right, so what atom is to science? If atom is to science, what is to social sciences? So what is the thing that is the smallest little thing in a social system? Because it's not an atom. Atom is a physical thing. So what is the equivalent in social systems or semiotic systems? The answer is really simple, but we don't know it because nobody teaches us. It's a symbol. Symbols. Symbols operate across all social systems. In religion, there are symbols. In language, there are symbols. In culture, there are symbols. Every socio-semiotic system, the basis is symbol. And yet, instead of looking at symbol as a unifying factor and understanding it and building understandings based on it, we divide all these disciplines. And then in linguistics, we look at the linguistic sign. In culture, we look at symbols of culture. And other things, we do other things. We have different terms for it. There's nothing unifying it because it's divide and rule. Right? So with that, I'm going to show you another point. Now, this point, I'm going to show it to you it's an interesting thing. So on this left-hand side, you will see on the top, one boli, one script. And on the right-hand side, you see one boli, 3 scripts. Right? So scripts is a writing system, right? Boli is just the oral. So when we look at English, we have one boli, and we really have one way of writing it. One set of symbols, the Roman systems, right? The characters. Now, of course, but if we look at my boli, which is spoken across South Asia, guess what happens? It's still one boli, but I can write it in a Persian-Arabic script. I can write it in a Roman script, and I can write it in a Devanagari script. Now, if I write it in the Devanagari script, it becomes Hindi. If I write it in Persian-Arabic script, it becomes Urdu. It's the same boli. It's the use of a writing system that is created to make divisions between people. And look around you. If you look around, all these linguists going around, for example, in Indonesia or the region, and who are creating new writing systems, they all create writing systems that are phonetic. Phonetic systems are the worst in the world. They're the worst kind of writing system. In fact, a lot of the Indo-Europe languages across Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, if historically they did have a writing system, because they did, some of them did have it, the writing systems they had evolved indigenously were syllabic. They were syllable marked, just like Japanese is. They were syllabic. They were not phonetic. Why do the European colonial linguists push for phonetic scripts? Because it permits divisions. Whereas a syllabic script would not. It will unify people. So in the case of North America, where Cherokee, the nation Cherokee was developing a script, the guy who developed the script, even though he was immersed in all these phonetic scripts, he did not choose to create a phonetic script for his language. Instead, he developed a syllabic script. And 10 years down the road, in 10 years, because of the syllabic script, they achieved 100% literacy rate in the Cherokee Nation. 100% literacy rate in a matter of 10 years. How? Because he had developed a syllabic script, not a phonetic one. Because a phonetic system will divide you. So even though the English, when I say one boli, one script, yes, it's the same characters, but guess what? If you're a Black American, if you're a Latino, if you come from a working class background, then you will not use the same spelling system, even though you will use the same characters. And the spelling systems will be based on your phonology. So how you speak, you might write slightly differently. And if you write in a different spelling, then the school will mark you wrong. You will fail. So the writing systems becomes an enemy of the people. It actually disempowers people. Again, something we often don't realize. Right? And yet symbols stay the primary driver across the field. Right? So I'll read this poem to you in English here. Symbols divide us. Symbols unite us. If your symbols match mine, perhaps we can be allies. If your symbols I don't recognize, you will be strange at best. Through symbols, we make sense of the world. Through symbols, we live our lives. In language, sound and scribbles are symbols. In religion, clothes and food become symbols. In culture, there is nothing that is not a symbol. In arts, in science, even in math, symbols rule our world. Symbols make our world, whether human or not. Where some use symbols in the here and now, we use symbols to escape place and time. A clever use of symbols, and lo, we can go to the moon and come back. A wise use of the symbol, and lo, we can create a just and fair world. A neglect of the symbols, and lo, we can fight and feed conflict. A malicious use of the symbols, and lo, we can destroy our worlds. Symbols are just symbols. They mean and they don't mean. A harmony in symbols is a harmony in life. A disarray in symbols is hell with no end in sight. So we see, again, the centrality of symbols and the projection of how we can use it. And so as we think about language and literature and really think about the world that we live in, we need to go back to the drawing board and re-theorize the very things that we do, the very disciplines that we study, and recreate our understandings based on things that we can observe and check and know, not stuff that is totally unobservable and has to be trusted because we have to pass a test. So That brings us to the last point that I want to share. This one is called religion. Religion were practices, acts of sharing, of caring, of being human. Along came the preachers, turning actions into things, naming divisions of oppression. Today, religion lie in books, something to own, something to fight about. Actions lost, symbols take control, tokens of belief to be had, no matter how they are gotten. Long gone are the practices that harmonized and healed. Today, owning symbols is religion. So, through these 3 points, I want to really highlight the centrality of how knowledge and manipulation of knowledge and manipulation of the knowledge about language can influence pretty much every aspect of our lives. And it actually enables colonial to continue to dominate us, to create theories that we have to follow, like trends and fads, right? I'll give you another trend and fad in applied linguistics and linguistics. If you look at research on identity today, there are literally thousands of books on them. I've done it too. We've done it. We all do study identity and language and identity. But if we were to just take a step back and look back at where do the first studies of language and identity come from? You realize this discipline is only about 30 years old. There are no references 30 years old. One of the primary references in applied linguistics and TESOL is Bonnie Norton, 1995. So before that, nobody was studying language and identity in the way that we are today. But yet today we are, because it's a fashion, it's a fad. And 10 years from now, this fashion will change into another fashion. And we're constantly following these fashions and these trends and fads, and we essentially deharmonize our own communities and our own relationships as a consequence of being trapped in this colonial mindset of divide and rule that comes not just as a political discourse, but comes as a fundamental way of creating knowledge and our understanding of the world and living in that world. So if we want the prosperity that our ancestors once had, we have to drop the divide and rule as an approach to knowledge making. And we have to adopt a unify and prosper approach. Unify and prosper. That's how prosperity is achieved. With that, I'm going to stop, and hopefully we'll have some time for discussion and questions. Thank you, everybody.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Mahbub. Very clear. Thank you for your poems, explanation, and great presentation. Your poem is also very interesting. We have listened from these two speakers from the studies of literature and linguistics. So now we have the session of discussion, question and answer sessions. So for those who have comments or questions, please raise your hand or just write down in the chat box. So I have one question here from Muhammad Naim Rahman. The question is, here in Pakistan, Boli is a literature genre comprising 2 parts. It is sung in form of a pair. First pair is sung by one person and the second part is sung by the second person. It creates melodic impact. Whether are you talking about this or Boli is just an expression. But before you answer this question, perhaps you can explain in brief what is Boli for some participants who are not familiar with the word or the term Boli. Yes.
It's a generic term for oral language, right? So it's like tongue. Like in English, you have tongue, right? A tongue means oral language. It's a metaphor for oral language. So Boli it's like we have a word Zaban as well, which is actually not, it's not, it divides people because Zaban and Bhasha creates a conflict between Hindi and Urdu, which becomes a political issue today in today's world. Boli transcends it. So I use the word Boli because it transcends the division between Hindi, Urdu, and some of the other languages in the region. But there are other terms. I'm sure in your own language, there is also a word that means just a spoken language. And it does not include writing. Writing is separated out. So when you look back into your own language, you realize your language does not make the confusion that linguists and English linguistics does. Our own languages don't. Our own languages are clearly marked along these ways. But if we study language and linguistics through books, then we confuse language as oral and writing. So oral is just Boli. So Boli is just a generic term in a sense for oral language.
Okay, so you want to respond the question from Muhammad in more detail, or is enough?
Thank you very much, sir. It's all right. Very wonderful and very good to listen to you. Thank you, Dr. Mahbub Ahmad. Thanks a lot, please.
Okay, Muhammad. So you are clear. Professor Mahbub, you want to add more?
What I'll do is I had this plan to share a few links with you guys, and I got into the flow of talking, so I never did it. I know there's more questions, and I'll have a look at it. In the meanwhile, I want to share an essay that I published recently. It's called 10 Myths That Keep Us Colonized. And in a sense, it will summarize and bring a lot of things that we just talked about into focus, but it also extends it. Because, for example, one of the first myths that I tackle is that knowledge is gradable, right? That we can grade knowledge. Of course, we know that, right? We all do this. Our universities are ranked. Individual academics are ranked. And everybody who gets ranked flouts their ranking. Oh, we are like number top 10, we are top 15. What are we doing? We're ranking knowledge. But knowledge is infinite, right? Knowledge has no limits. We can never think like a duck. And that is knowledge as well, right? Knowledge is infinite. So, and anything that's infinite, by definition, cannot have internal hierarchies. It cannot. And yet we live in a world where we do it. We actually perform that. We perform the ranking of knowledge. That's where colonization brings it in, right? Because we take the rankings coming from the West. We put our own knowledge systems at the bottom, and we talk about how our knowledge has to be ranked in relation to the West. So we've done this. We've created this grading in knowledge, which essentially enables our own colonization, right? So this is one of the first myths that I tackle. I talk about a lot of things, including, as I said, language. So language is spoken and written. So that's where I sort of talk about the distinction around these things. And also talk about different ways of doing script writing, because these are all really interesting things. You know, thinking that religion is a belief. Religion is not a belief, it's a practice. It's a practice of ethics and integrity. You know, you can have any belief, but if you're going to hurt somebody else, you don't have the practice, right? We confuse all of these things, and these confusions often come to us in English or another colonial language. And they were mostly introduced during the colonial period, right? Because when we are looking at a lot of these things, like we're creating categories, we're creating a category of language, we're creating a category of religion, we're creating a category of culture, we create all these categories. But we have to remember that categories don't actually exist in nature. Humans create categories to study or engage with the world. Categories do not exist by themselves. Even a tree does not have branches and leaves and a stem and roots. We say that it has branches and stems and roots. It's our way of engaging with a tree. A tree in itself doesn't have any of that. A tree is just a tree. So any categories that we create, we have to remember that it's us humans that are creating the categories. And categories don't exist by themselves. If we're creating categories, we really need to understand why these categories are being created. Who created these categories? For what purpose? How come these categories were created? A lot of these categories emerged because the European colonizers were capturing the rest of the world. And as they moved around the rest of the world and captured all these different places, they came across very different sets of practices. And therefore, they had to develop categories in order to study them. These became the various different disciplines that have evolved over time. They're based in the colonial expansion. And that's why the English language is seen as the most developed, because all of that was in English. But if we look at the nature of knowledge itself, we realize it doesn't need to be. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, there is another second questions on the chat box from Irham Aladis. Do you want to continue?
Yeah, got this. It's like, so again, I said that I just sent, it lists 10 different myths. There are actually more, but these 10 are very important. I think we need to start from them. So when we talk about decolonization of knowledge making, it's a tricky thing. You can't actually do that until you have decolonized yourself as an individual, right? Because unless you have decolonized yourself to a certain degree, and it cannot be total because we live in a world that's colonized. Yeah, I still have to work and live in a world where I have to exist. So it's not full, but we have to start a process of decolonizing ourselves as individuals that actually opens us to looking at the world from a different set of perspectives. And we don't know what the right way is there because we can never really know. But we do know that if it has to be based on observable things, not theoretical and abstract concepts that don't exist, right? Nouns don't exist, verbs don't exist, adjectives don't exist. We create them. Writing systems never existed until they were brought in through European colonization. We know that most indigenous communities around the world did not have writing systems. They did not have writing systems. They did not have counting systems, which means they had no numbers. No numbers. They didn't exist. Most indigenous languages in the world don't have a counting system. That's why we borrow English counting systems. Why did they not have a counting system? Because you don't need it. Literacy and numeracy, both are needs of the trading classes. So the traders had it. That's why the Arabs had it. The Chinese had it. The Europeans had it, but not the rest of the world because they were not traders. So they never developed. In Australia, where I live now, this is actually occupied lands, right? Australia was never ceded. So it was captured and it's still a colony. It's a captured lands, never ceded. And in Australia, not a single language of Australia had a writing system. Not a single language of Australia had a counting system. You don't need them to live. And yet, today's education in the world, we can't survive without these two things. And notice, both of them are not natural human abilities. They're not. We have to learn it in schools. And if we don't learn it right, we never get jobs. So it's the very process of education that does that to us. It allows that kind of colonization to take place. And it cripples our own populations because we start judging other people because of their literacy and their ability to count and write. Not all the other things that they have, right? The grammar of dance, the semantics of color, all of these things, beautiful things that existed, right? No more. Now, I actually live a nomadic life and spend a lot of time living in community on land. And over that period of time, I've realized that actually language can actually harm you in times. We think like language is essential for human survival. That's not necessarily true. In some contexts, language is actually extremely not good for you. It can be dangerous even. I'll give you one example. Let's say we want to go hunting. Now I see a herd of something there that I want to hunt. Guess what? If I start talking to my friends and my family, hey, there's this herd, let's go get it. Guess what's going to happen? Those animals will run away and I'll get nothing. So instead of using language, I'll have to use other ways of vocalizing or marking things. I might use sign language, I might whistle, right? Create sounds that are more aligned with other natural sounds and not human language, because human language will scare the animal away. So, and in those contexts, you don't need to count, because either you have food or you don't. You don't need to count if there are 5 apples or 10 apples. If there's an apple tree, there are apples. If there's no apple tree, there are no apples. You don't need these systems that are fundamental to the way that our societies work today. That's why I said I can't totally decolonize myself, because I exist in a world that happens. And yet we need to be aware, and not just that, in our own academic practices, we need to shift the way we teach our students. We need to shift the way that we get them to do assignments. We need to shift the very requirements that we have of our students. So for example, in my own postgraduate program and my own courses, I don't assign a single reading list. I'll suggest some readings, but it is their project. It is their goal of in that semester, something they have to create that will benefit the community and the people that they're part of, something real. They have to create it, something that doesn't exist, right? They have to create it. And in trying to create it, they of course have to do a lot of reading. They have to do a lot of learning. They have to do a lot of things. So it's guided by need. And because it's being guided by the real world need, the students can easily reject things that are not going to be useful, and they will find things that will be useful. So that it's not my approach or what I want them to read that leads them into learning. It's their need to understand that reading literacy is a tool to empower yourself. It's not something you have to memorize. We don't need memorization of definitions. There's no need. We need application of things in a real world context to create real world things. Now, if we had time, I'll be happy to show you some of those real world things. There's tons of them. I'll give you one example. I don't have an image for it, but I'll tell you one of them. A group of my students who live in China, they worked with a supermarket chain, and they created bags, not fabric bags, recyclable, reusable cloth bags. And they created a design and writing on it so that anybody who's walking around with that bag, one, the bag itself is recyclable, it's reuse, multiple use, but the messaging on the bag is one of environmental protection. So anybody who looks at the bag also gets the same message. So we see then it's an application of language, but in a very different context, in a real world setting where students are actually creating something, right? And I'll give you one more example. Let me just get it. It's something that I've been working on and building again through it would be great if you guys can work through these things. I'll just give you an example, the Ribbit pond. So let me send you the link first, and then I'll share a screen as well. So the Ribbit pond is a book, it's a picture book that my master's student wrote. He wrote it first initially in English and Spanish because he was from South America. And then it developed into one where we have so many languages. So you can have Arabic and you can choose. You can even have Indonesian, right? And then you can go through the book and you have a bilingual version, which is English and in Bahasa Indonesia. Or, right, so you have the Arabic and the Bahasa Malay. You can change Arabic to Chinese. You can change Indonesian to Greek. It's in 26 languages at the moment, and hopefully we will keep growing it. Now, in addition to that, my students have started working on teaching ideas, learning Vietnamese with the Ribbit pond, learning Chinese with the Ribbit pond. So the students are learning to create resources. And in order to create these resources, they have to learn understand language is, understand all the other stuff, read all this stuff. But the end goal is create something that can be of real use and real value in the world that we live in.
Yeah. Yes, we have from Jumharia another questions. Do you think the past and the future is disturbed the focus on the present? Do you think romanticism, which tends to live the present or back to nostalgia, is a strategy?
Yes, thank you so much for that question. It's really interesting. Why do they create past? Because if you look at any of the history books, they're all histories that are full of violence. These people were killing these people were warring these people, there was conflict in this area, there's conflict. Every history is the history of violence. Why? We know that in most parts of the world, people live prosperous and nice, good lives. There was not a lot of violence. Or if it was limited to a local area. It wasn't widespread like it is today. So why create histories of violence? Why? Because it does two things. It justifies and condones colonial violence against other people and other lands, so that they can justify to do it because the others have already been doing it. And unfortunately, by reading those histories, it makes us more prone to violence as well, because we think if our ancestors were doing it, it's all right. And these are big problems. I don't want to really, so these are really big problems that happens. Now, why future? Guess what? Everything that we are marketed vacations, marketed holidays, marketed this, its existence is in the future. And as we know with COVID, when COVID or some reality hits, all those futures just crash because they never existed. Yet we can spend money for that future, right? So it enables marketing. It enables the capitalist world that we live in. So that's why they created past and present. It was done very deliberately in the 17th century. It's in the history of the English language. And it's in the history of the European use of the printing press. Now, the printing press, as many of you might know, was actually not invented in Germany at all. The printing press has been invented many times across in many places. The key difference was in Germany, it was at the time of Martin Luther, who used the printing press in order to create the reformist movement. So when Martin Luther was alive, something obnoxious like 90% of everything that was published in the German language was written by Martin Luther. And through that, the Europeans understood the power of the written word and the power of literacy. And then from there on, they have just continually built on it and expanded it to every part of the world, so nobody can escape it now.
Okay, thank you, Professor Mahbub. I hope Bu Jumharia get the clear explanation. So we go to the next question. This is for Professor Mori. How is the development of transnational Muslim writing nowadays? I also have additional questions related to this because I also interesting to know how is the transnational Muslim writing in Western countries, especially in UK, US, and Australia, for example, if you can explore more. And another personal question is related to socio and cultural aspect of English in transnational writing, in transnational Muslim writing in literature. So how the socio-cultural aspect of English appear or used in this kind of literature. Yep. For Professor Mori, the time is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, the first thing to say, I think, is that very much along the lines of the discussion that we've started having with Alma's brilliant presentation. These things are all context specific. And so in my definition, I suppose, of transnational Muslim writing that I began with, I was tending to make a point about Muslim writing that either is from the West, in other words, writers may have moved there, or the second and third generation, or which is addressing itself to the West. There's a whole lot of other national, subnational, and probably trans or international Muslim writing within and for Muslim audiences within Muslim countries, which is not what I was addressing. I think you understand that. But the very fact that it is addressing this market in a particular way places certain responsibilities on the writers, or rather it puts certain pressures on the writers in the ways that I described with Kamala Shamsi. So that's one thing I would say about that, that the model that I'm describing is particularly in relation to the kinds of novels which circulate globally, the kinds of novels which are put on university reading lists, the kind of novels which win awards. That's one kind of thing. Other kinds of narrative, other kinds of storytelling, if you want to think about oral traditions, obviously operate differently within different spheres of influence and relevance. So that's one thing. The point about the development of transnational Muslim writing, though, I think is only partially accounted for by what I said, and I chose to focus on the one thing. Because the other thing that is worth noting is the huge diversification of theme, particularly, but also of types of writers who are operating that's happened in the last 10 years, probably not that much more than 10 years, which is to say, as I mentioned, a lot of the first generation or second generation Muslim writers post 9/11 are in a way obliged to talk about issues of radicalization and securitization and those kinds of things. And Home Fire is in a way the kind of most realized example that I could think of that, along with Reluctant Fundamentalists probably. But above and beyond, and in a way, one of the more interesting developments now is the generic diversification of writing by Muslim writers. For example, just here on the way, I've been in Lahore now for 2 weeks, and on the way on the plane and then subsequently while I was here, I read 2 books. One was a book called This Green and Pleasant Land by Aisha Malik, which was a genre piece really, which was looking at the English country village, which itself is an ideological construction, but it's also an ideological construction in fiction. So many writers down the years, and this relates to Romanticism, have set, particularly in pre-industrial times, set their works in English villages. And the English village comes to have a sort of talismanic relationship to what English and British identity is taken to be. And this book by Aisha Malik positions a Muslim family who've moved into an English village and explores some of the pressures, and it's serious issues, but it's also done quite lightly because it's hooking into a genre which itself has been subject to parody and satire. So that's the kind of writing that you wouldn't have seen 20 years ago, because even if someone wanted to write it, no one would have published it. The second book, which I looked at, is Simon Mears' The Khan, which is a kind of gritty, hard-boiled crime thriller novel, which again is taking a form which is very well known, but populating it with Muslim community preoccupations, in this case in the northern English city of Bradford, and interweaving with this story of crime and murder and all sorts of things, weaving into it the social experiences and the backgrounds and the deprivation and the marginalization that's taken place within communities in the north of England, such that their own codes of honor have evolved and crime syndicates have evolved accordingly. So those 2 books would be my most recent examples of literature that does not address itself to securitization, that does not address itself to radicalization or any of those stereotypical things, but which is carving a new niche. There's a lot of romance writing as well by Muslim women writers which does this. So I think the field of transnational Muslim writing is opening up a lot, and I should definitely not want to end today without saying that. The question of English, I think, this goes back to language, doesn't it? English as a lingua franca, allows books and ideas to circulate. There is, though, I think, very much an argument for localism, in the sense that I was kind of understanding Arma's presentation to kind of touch on this as well, which means that most of the time I was talking about the nation. The Muslim communities in Home Fire are, in a sense, trapped by the nation, included, excluded, according to how well they fit the requirements. The most familiar, probably post-colonial paradigm since those moments has been transnationalism or indeed planetarity, which is a concept associated with theorists like Gayatri Spivak and various others, which is about the way that communities move across the world, and therefore pattern shifts, language shifts, and so on as communities move across the world. I always think that's very good. I always think it's slightly utopian at the same time, because the issues that communities, minority communities in Western countries face, we see this in the shootings in New Mexico just recently, for example, but also everyday things, are local issues, local politics, those kinds of things. So I think one of the things that English does is allows these ideas and these books to circulate, but one of the dangers is a homogenization that might happen as a result of that. So on the one hand, the canon, if you like, of Muslim writing is opening up. In another, there are other dangers waiting, which could be to do with homogenization.
Yes, thank you, Professor Mori. We have 4 more minutes. Is there any question or comment? If there is no more question or comment, so we are going to have a closing statement from both speakers. So start from Professor Mahbub, and next Professor Mori for your last closing statement.
Oh, thank you. I was while I was listening to Peter, I was also doing other things, with being displaced. That's another problem. Displacements create multiple possibilities for us to engage in different things at the same time. Not always a good thing. I won't say it's a good thing, but it did create some opportunities to me. So what you will see in the discussion board, I posted a number of links. I have actually shared a couple of books that I've been working on. These are draft books, not yet published. I'm still working on them, but I'm happy to share them with you. The first one is Subaltern Practice. Peter, you mentioned Gayatri Spivak's work and the question about the subaltern voice and things. I actively use the word subaltern, but I also actively use the phrase subaltern action and subaltern practice, because there is subaltern practice and we can create it. So the first book I shared here is Subaltern Practice, a practical guide. So it steps you through approaches that we can go through in order to create practice. And then I shared with you some information about the trash project, which is a fascinating sort of an approach. We go around collecting trash with any language on it in different suburbs and areas, and use that to create a health profile of the region. Because trash is an indicator of what sort of things people consume. And if you find a lot of trash with candy wrappers and cold drinks and soda and things, it tells you that it's a very high sugar diet, which is an indicator of certain kind of problems in the community: diabetes, bad teeth for children, all cardiovascular problems. So by understanding the relationship of these things, we can actually tackle very complex health problems in our own community. So that's another one that I shared. And the last thing that I'm going to share, I haven't done it yet, I was just doing it when you asked me to put my notes together, is I will share with you the making of the Ribbit Pond, which is actually based on my student's master's thesis. And what you will note that his dissertation did not follow the traditional approach of chapter 1 introduction, chapter 2 literature review, chapter 3 methodology. No, he wrote the dissertation as if it's a book to help other people to create stories like he did.
Yeah, thank you, Professor.
I'll just send it to you guys. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. Next, Professor Mori, you have 1 minute for closing statement.
I want to talk about daffodils, actually. Only to say that I think this relates to Gayatri Spivak again, in actual fact. The idea of culturally inappropriate, I don't know if that's the right phrase, education, the colonial education legacy is one that everyone, I think, labours under, particularly in ways that we've heard about today. And so writers of the transnational Muslim variety that I've talked about, Kamla Shamsi and so on, are in a sense trying to encapsulate that experience as well. Usually in English, or at least in the books that we learn about and read, because of the global marketplace that exists. But I think one of the exciting things, and one of the things I'm looking forward to, is the possibility that this type of writing will continue to diversify and become more normalized in a way, and not be seen as exotic anymore. And that's something that hopefully will happen as time goes on.
Okay, thank you, Professor Mori. So we are now in the closing plenary session. Thank you very much. Give applause for all speakers and all participants here. Thank you, everyone. And now, before I end this plenary session, we need a documentation to take a picture together. I hope you don't mind to on cam. So the committee, Akbar, are you ready? We'll take a picture for all of us. Akbar, are you there?
Yeah, Miss.
Yeah, please on cam so that we can see your beautiful and handsome faces. Okay, you can count, Akbar, when you're ready.
Okay, for the first slide, 1, 2, 3. And then for the next slide, 1, 2, 3. And then for the last slide, 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you, Akbar. Thank you very much, all speakers and all participants and committee. So this is the end of plenary session. And after this, we are going to have panel session for all presenters. So the presenters should go to the breakout rooms. So there are some rooms that have been divided into based on the timetable and based on the schedule. So from me as the chair, thank you very much and enjoy the panel session. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Peter, thank you so much, Peter, for your time and support, and also Prof. Mahbub from Sydney. Hope to see you again face to face. Amin, inshallah.
Okay, thank you, Maria Ulfa, for sharing this session. Also appreciate for keynote speaker, Professor Peter Mori and Professor Ahmad Mahbub. And now the next session is panel session. It will be divided into 7 panel. Panel 1 will be chaired by Bu Ida Rosida. Are you ready, Bu Ida Rosida?
Sure.
Okay, panel 2 will be chaired by Pak Supardi. Are you with us, Pak Supardi? Okay, panel 3 will be chaired by Dr. Wahyu Kusumayanti. Dr. Wahyu, are you ready?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, panel 4 will be chaired by my colleague Ahmad Zaki. Ahmad Zaki, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Okay, and then panel 5 will be chaired by Ibu Solikatus Sa'dia. Are you with us, Bu Solikatus Sa'dia? Okay. Okay, panel 6 will be chaired by Bu Pita Merdeka. Are you with us, Bu Ida? Bu Pita, sorry. Okay.
Yes, I'm ready.
Then panel 7 by Bu Nina Farlina. For the chair, would you please to take lead the panel session. And then for the presenter, make sure you are join with breakout rooms according to your panel. Okay, enjoy the conference.
For those who haven't joined the breakout rooms, you can click breakout rooms and then choose one of the rooms, one of the panels. There are 7 panels. So you just click to join one of the panels. Thank you. Once again, for the participants who are still in the main room, you can join.
Hello, can you make me join panel 2?
You can just click 3 dots on the Zoom and then you find the words breakout room and then find one of the panels. You can just click join in one of the panels.
There is no breakout rooms here, just whiteboard, disconnect audio, raise hand, chat, meeting settings. There is no breakout rooms. Yes, now.
Are you using mobile phone or laptop? Are you using mobile phone or laptop? Is there anyone who have problem in joining the breakout room? You can find in the Zoom, there are 3 dots on the bottom, and then you can click, and then you can see breakout rooms, and then you can click, and then choose one of the panels. There are 7 panels, and click join in one of the panels that you choose. Okay, Ahmad Kasim has joined panel 2. Okay, thank you, admin. Anyone else has any problem in joining the breakout room? Yes, we are in the panel session now. For those who are still in the main room, please join the breakout room. You can choose one of the panels.
Sorry, ma'am, I would like to ask, is there any information about the topics for each panel? Because I cannot find it. Maybe I'm late.
You can see on the chat box, there is a timetable of the panel.
Okay.
You can download it. Pak Supardi, you should go to the panel because you are one of the chair of the panel. You can join one of the panel, Pak Supardi.
Okay, thank you for the information, ma'am.
Sorry, excuse me.
Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam, Pak Dahlan.
I am in the channel 5.
Panel 5.
Yeah.
Admin, can you send Pak Dahlan to panel 5?
Right.
Pak Dahlan, can you find the sign of breakout room in the Zoom in the bottom of Zoom?
I cannot find I cannot find. Can you give me?
Yeah.
Can you direct me to the breakout room?
Okay, if you use laptop, you can see the words participant, chat, share screen, record, and breakout rooms. So you click the words or the symbol of breakout rooms, and after you choose or click the breakout room symbol, and then you find there are 7 panels, and then you see the blue sign of joining one of the panels. You can just click one of the panels that you choose.
I'm still confused, man. I try to follow your instruction. Right. Participants.
Yeah.
And then I choose which one.
In the Zoom, in the bottom of the Zoom,
I come to the participant and then.
No, not in a participant. In a Zoom, in your laptop, in the bottom of the Zoom, there are some symbol. One is participant, one is chat, another one is share screen, another one is record, another one is breakout room, and then you click the breakout room.
But there is no breakout room icons here.
Oh, I see. Pak Arif?
In my laptop, there is no. Okay, right.
Salam, dibuka mic-nya. Coba kamu cek admin untuk memasukkan Pak Dahlan ke panel 5. Bisa langsung dari admin ya?
Yeah,
okay.
Right.
Wait a second, admin will bring you to panel 5. Pak Dahlan to panel 5. And then who else? Salam bisa memasukkan.
Oke, sudah. Okay.
Ya.
Finish.
Ya, langsung join kalau sudah ada, Pak.
Okay, right. Thank you, ma'am.
Yes. Anyone else? Pak Rohman, Pak Husni Tamrin, Sahrul Yani, Umi Waisiyah, Fitria Tuzakiyah. Do you have any problem in joining the breakout room? Umi Yahwisa, Husni Tamrin, Rohman, Fitriatus Zakiyah, Sahrul Yani. Okay, Zakiatul Mufidah, and then Hilal Ahmad Khan. Do you want to join the breakout room? Which panel? Just choose.
Yes, sir. I want to join.
Okay, just click breakout room. Just click the breakout rooms and then choose one of the panels that you want to join.
Okay, well, I actually one of the presenter, and I just forgot which panel that.
Okay, so you can go to the chat box. You can go to the chat box, and then in the chat box there is an agenda timetable.
Yes.
LITA International Conference, so you can see that the name of the panel and the presenter of each panel. So,
I found it. I'm in panel 5. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay.
Please join the
I'm
panel.
joining panel 5. Thank you.
Yes. Umi Wasia, Rohman, and the others. If you want to join the panels, please choose one of the panels. Thank you. Salam, you are still in this main room, yeah? Because I want to join the panel.
Halo. Halo.
Yes. Yes.
Who is the admin here? Halo. Ini adminnya siapa ya? Halo. Bung Arif. Sastra Inggris UIN Jakarta.
Hello, good afternoon.
Baik, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Very good evening, everyone. Peace be upon you, dear college. I believe that during this day, all of us have obtained a fruitful discussion. Then finally, it is a pleasure to be here at the closing session. There is saying in bahasa Indonesia, ada perjumpaan maka ada perpisahan, which means when there is a meeting, then there will be goodbye. In the second LITA International Conference, whose main theme is Transnational Islamic Literature and English Studies, we have learned a lot from the keynote session delivered by the amazing keynote speakers and invited speakers who have shared their interesting work. Once again, on behalf of the committee, thank you for delivering such important material so that all of us can deepen our knowledge. Furthermore, I would like to thank all presenters and participants who have joined this conference from all over the world. Sincerely hope this contributes to linguistic and literary fields. And finally, I would like to thank all the committee members for organizing this conference and ensuring that it proceeded smoothly. I would like also to apologize for any inconvenience that you might experience during this conference. So this second LITA International Conference officially closing by saying Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin. See you everyone. Bye-bye. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Arif, we will take a photo session first.
Goodbye.
Photo session first, Pak. Don't leave.
Bye.
Dear participants, we have to take a picture first.
Take picture.
Scene 1, please turn on your camera. 3, 2, 1. Okay, slide 2. 3, 2, 1.